Hi, welcome everyone. We're so glad to be hosting this talk today. I'm Jen Shonger from the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence, which is funded in part by the New Jersey Governor's Council for Medical Research and Treatments in Autism and by the New Jersey Department of Health. I am thrilled to be here today with Dr. Dora Raymaker, who is a system scientist and social services intervention researcher at Portland State University's Regional Research Institute for Human Services, where they conduct community-based participatory research in collaboration with autistic and mental health communities to improve health and life outcomes. Dr. Raymaker co-directs the ASPIRE network, which we spoke to Dr. Nicolaitis about last month, and is the associate editor of Autism in Adulthood. And in their 3 minutes of free time, the author of science fiction novels. Dr. Raymaker will be talking to us today about the perspective of the autistic community and research. And we'll draw on their experience as both an academic autism researcher and an autistic community leader to share insights into neurodiversity and autistic culture, use of language, community values and priorities, and how to build trust given a historically at times painful relationship between the autistic and academic research communities. Um, some brief housekeeping notes. You will need to be logged into YouTube if you would like to ask a question. We strongly encourage questions and we hope that you will ask them if you have them. We will monitor the chat throughout and we will cover all the questions at the end of the talk. Um, this session will be available to watch at any time after the session ends on our YouTube channel, um, which you can also find on our Facebook page and website as well. Welcome, Dr. Raymaker. Um, so I'm going to go off camera right now while Dr. Raymaker presents, and then I'll be back for the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you for having me. Today, first, I'm going to introduce myself and my positioning and a few key concepts just to get set up. And then I'm going to dive into understanding the autistic community, its history and culture, and its relationship to research. And then with those frames, I'll talk a little bit about some things to consider when building research collaborations with the autistic community, and end with an example of the benefits of community research or collaboration. And then I will love to answer your questions. So I'm full-time research faculty at PSU's Regional Research Institute for Human Services and co-director of the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, or ASPIRE. So as Jen said, I conduct community-based participatory research with the autistic disability and mental health communities with a focus on services interventions, mostly relating to employment and health. My field is system science, and my aim is always science for social. I'm also a bridge person in that I'm both an academic researcher and an autistic member of the autistic community. NJ's originally contacted Christina Nicolaitis, Aspire's other co-director and my partner in crime who gave a companion talk to this one last week, to do a webinar on language and the need for researchers to be attuned to community priorities. Christina really loved the idea, but pointed out rightly that an autistic person should probably be involved and looped me into the conversation. So I have the advantage of being a principal investigator on NIH-funded autism researcher, so I get the science and social services side of things. And I'm also an autistic self-advocate and have been a service recipient, so I get the community's culture and the need from the autistic. I've also been in the midst of substantial change in that relationship between the autistic community and the research community over the past decades. So the bridge in this picture is the Portland Steel Bridge, which is my absolute favorite Portland bridge, and that is where I live. Before I get into the meat of the talk, I want to frame some reasons why researchers might want to engage with the autistic community. Why does it matter? And I'll return to these points at the end with an illustration, but I'd also like you to keep them in your thoughts as I talk. So first, autism research really impacts the quality of our lives. This could be very directly, for example, by developing and testing an intervention that could have either positive or negative outcomes. But it could be indirectly too, for example, by perpetuating or disproving a false stereotype that could then have ripple effects on how people treat us. The second, on the flip side, we affect the quality of autism research. If we're not cooperating, if we don't understand the study instructions, or we find the research questions or materials offensive, then that's going to impact the quality of the data that you're able to collect. So our involvement could really be the difference between a successful intervention and one that failed to understand what we even wanted in the first place. And lastly, it matters because cooperating can lead to really positive change. A well-constructed research study that answers questions the autistic community values can lead to high-quality research that positively then affects everybody's. Getting those really impactful, fulfilling collaborations, however, is a lot easier said than done. The autistic community and people with disabilities as a whole have a really long, difficult history with respect to. There's a long-term history of harm and exploitation, including some really extreme cases like the Willowbrook study, which is often pulled out as an exemplar of why we need institutional review boards. There's also a long history of disempowerment, where autistic people have been removed from the community, disempowered, and discriminated against. One facet of that disempowerment is exclusion from research. That includes from general population studies, it includes in autism research, as researchers, and in policy that drives research funding. Research is done on us or about us, but it's not done with us. Also, with autism research, unlike something everyone can agree on, like that researching a vaccine for COVID-19 is a good thing, there are often opposing research priorities between what different autism stakeholders want. And autistic people are historically less able to have their priorities honored if you think again about the disempowerment and inclusion. For example, is training autistic people to maintain eye contact, a priority of some studies and stakeholders, helpful or harmful? What about the autistic people who say that eye contact has hurt their ability to concentrate, erodes their self-esteem, or causes large stress load? What about the research that has come out about how masking autistic traits may lead to suicidal behavior? Is more eye contact a healthy outcome or an unhealthy outcome? These rifts go well beyond just research priorities and aren't necessarily always the researcher's fault because there's a cross-cultural communication issue and a lack of understanding the autistic community on a cultural level or even that a culture exists. Um, I remember years ago talking with a sleep researcher who had an interest in autism about funding for one of ASPIRE's early studies. And he said to us, well, why not just go to Autism Speaks? That's where I get all of my funding. And Christina and I had to tell him that if we did that, the autistic community wouldn't give us the time of day on that study. It would be seen as a deep betrayal, and ASPIRE would probably be done before it got started because he didn't know, he had no idea that the autistic community at that time was actively engaged in protests with that organization that were being led, in fact, by ASPIRE's own community-based organization partner. But how would he know, right? He's not connected to community. So you can see here a long history that has engendered a massive lack of trust. So I'm talking a lot about autistic community here and community priorities, and I was asked to do this webinar about autistic community and research. So I'd like to take a moment to define what I mean by that phrase in this webinar, but usually what I usually mean. So I'm talking for the most part about the community of people who have been diagnosed as or self-identify as being on the autism spectrum. A community is not a population. So I am not talking about the general population of people with an autism spectrum diagnosis or who identify as being on the spectrum. A community, very specifically, is a group that has a shared history. It has shared values, culture, language, and symbols. Communities provide safety and support and a sense of belonging, and they're protective. The autistic community is not monolithic. You won't find everyone sharing everything and agreeing on anything any more than you would in any large international community. But it is a true community and it is held together by all of those things that define community. So if you know autistic people who don't engage in this culture. That's okay. They're part of the population, not the community. Um, so nothing really is going to give you a sense for the culture, like immersing yourself in it. But I'd like to give just a brief introduction to the community's history, culture, and relationship to research to give some perspective on its richness, complexity, and maybe why you could encounter some pushback as a researcher. So in my very brief history, I just want to disclaimer this so you know that this is a very high level overview and I'm covering only a few touch points. It's focused on those community events and developments that have touched my life most directly or that connect up very directly to this research linkage. There are way, way, way more people and events and important aspects to our community than I can cover here. Like any community, we have a rich and varied history, and I encourage you to look at primary sources and explore links, and mostly talk to as many other autistic people as you can to get a richer view. Just, just a starting. So our current community is founded on events that precede us, notably the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which inspired the disability rights movement. Then there was a large push of deinstitutionalization in the 1980s and the creation of self-advocacy movement for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Autism was a brand new diagnosis in the 80s, so we were often lumped into these other categories previously. Um, uh, Autism also has been largely treated as a separate thing from other disabilities, with a focus on curing it like a disease rather than accommodating it like someone would if they'd been paralyzed or if they had Down syndrome. Um, so in the 1990s, the autistic community began to define itself as distinct from some of these other disability rights communities and try to figure out how to change these narratives and how to reframe things from a disability rights perspective and figure out what being autistic even means because that it's, you know, again, a was a very new diagnosis at the time. Also foundational to community is the shift in thinking about what disability even. So this is the disability rights framing again. In the medical or pathological model of disability, disability is considered a deficit that should be remediated or fixed. However, in the social or socioeconomic model of disability, disability is considered a byproduct of a mismatch between someone's functional needs and the environment that they exist within. So the social model makes the point that the world is set up to accommodate the abilities of the majority, most of whom would be very disabled in a world that was set up for people with a different set of abilities. For example, hearing people would be quite disabled in a world built for deaf people that doesn't pay any attention to how loud noises are. Hearing people would have a really hard time functioning in a really noisy world. So these shifting frames around disability, the empowerment of disability communities over time to be included and accommodated in society, this has all been moving along for decades. And the autistic community is rooted in these shifts and in these movements. Um, so we trace kind of back to the early 90s. In 1992, Donna Williams, who is pictured here being gloriously autistic, and Jim Sinclair met and decided to start a new organization called Autism Network International to help connect people with each other around the world. Shortly thereafter, Jim published a really important essay, Don't Mourn for Us, which I think the link should be with the YouTube video. That was in reaction to the medical or pathological view of autism, and is very, very worth reading in full if you have not before. The autistic community's first home then became this nascent internet, like, 1992, 93 is around when we get internet. So we're kind of growing up together. And on the internet via the ANI newsletter and a listserv of autistic people around the world, um, we began to connect with each other for the very first time. One topic of discussion was how professional and scientific autism conferences were ironically totally inaccessible or even hostile to actually autistic people. So thinking about these conferences as a touch point with research. So this was actually part of the impetus for ANI's creation of Autreat, which was an autistic run conference and retreat that was created by, for, and to meet our needs. And Autreat ran annually from 1996 until 2013, and it provided a physical space for autistic people to meet and for autistic culture to develop and flourish. Around the same time as Autreat in 1996, a sociologist named J.D. Singer coined the term neurodiversity to refer to the idea that neurocognitive differences should be recognized as a protective class, along with race, gender, sexual preference, etc., and that people who experience neurocognitive differences like autistic people also experience similar types of discrimination and oppression. So think about the disempowerment, the exclusion, those things. The Atlantic published on Singer's work in 1998, and it started to get more into public consciousness. Although Singer is given the main credit for the word, it was really cropping up either that word or that idea very much in many of the autistic, mad, and disabled spaces around that same time. And also, just to know, it's not specific to autism alone, although the idea was very, very quickly absorbed into the community's fabric. Um, so the autistic community grew substantially in the early 2000s, and very much capitalizing on the internet as that grew as well. Community resources and spaces, from websites to autistic, in fact, an autistic-owned island on Second Life with an autism history museum. These all expanded. One of my favorite resources was the autistics.org website, which you can still get to through the Wayback Machine. I think I have a link, a video. It had a lot of really serious stuff on it, but it also had some wonderful flights of humor and community in-jokes, like the Institute for the Neurologically Typical, which was a scathing and really, really funny application of the pathological or medical model of disability to non-disabled people. And you can still read that off the back machine. Fun. So words like neurotypical were becoming part of the community's shared language. And speaking of language, in 1999, Jim Sinclair published the essay Why I Dislike Person First Language as part of the community's embracing of identity first language. Autism in the public and policy context was also growing very much at this time. The public was becoming more aware of it. This was no longer an idea of this like rare childhood disease that no one needs to think about. It was becoming part of the language of society. Um, so research was starting to become more focused in that area as well. The first incarnation of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, which is the federal government's autism research policy unit, convened in Washington with, at the time, a focus on children, and of course, without any actually autistic people represented in its numbers. So the committee responsible for deciding priorities in autism research included no actually autistic. I want to back up for a moment, though, and go a little deeper on Jim's essay on language. So one of the reasons why Jen asked me to do this webinar was to explain the whole language thing. So here's a bit more on that. But Jim's essay is short and it's lovely to read, and I recommend that you do so in full. But here are the three main points in Jim's words. One, saying person with autism suggests that the autism can be separated from the person, like a person with a purple shirt. Two, saying person with autism suggests that even if the autism is a part of the person, it isn't a very important part. For example, we say male and female people, not people with maleness and people with femaleness. And three, saying person with autism suggests that autism is something bad, so bad that it isn't even consistent with being a person. For example, we say a left-handed person, not a person with left-handedness. And also, The autistic community has autistic culture, just like the deaf community has deaf culture, which may feel a little bit more familiar to people when they think about that. But it's the same idea. And community is a really important part of identity. So I am I am an Italian American. I am not an American with Italian. The community definitely prefers identity first language, and there's been research around this, actual solid research, and it's formed the basis for using identity first language now as a standard in many scientific journals, such as the International Journal of Autism and Autism in Adulthood. Um, but as I said earlier, a community isn't a population, and using preferred language is a really great way to show that you respect someone. So broadly, you're speaking broadly, identity first language is preferred. But on an individual level, I really love the idea of person-centered language, which Radical Copy Editor explains beautifully in this cartoon. Um, so it's a dialogue, and the first person says, "I'm autistic and blind." The second person says, "No, you're a person with autism spectrum disorder and blindness." No, I'm autistic and blind." The first person says, "That is incorrect language." The first person is rather upset. But under this idea of person centered language, the first person asks, "What language do you use to describe yourself?" And the second person says, "I'm autistic and blind." And the first person says, "Cool. Should I use that language to describe you too?" And they say, "Yes, please." "Thanks, will do." And everybody is happy. But back to the IACC and its relationship between the autism community or the autistic community and research. So the mid 2000s, we had a lot to protest. um, the stuff comes in waves. Autism had at this point become a really big politically fraught part of the public social consciousness, and the friction between those pathologicalization models and attempts by the community to advance a civil rights and anti-oppressive agenda got really particularly bad for a while. And we reacted in some ways that actually ended up being super cool long term. So for one, it caused me, Christina, and some of my community friends on the internet to start Aspire in 2006. Christina had been following me on an autistic parent e-list. She's the parent. I was there trying to help parents understand their children and wanted to meet me. Being the wise person she is, she realized an invitation to unstructured social time would probably not work so well. So she created an autism journal club to lure me into interaction over research papers. If you're going to engage with the autistic community, take notes from Christina. It's good to know how to woo us. So Christina and I had read probably about 3 articles before the issues in the research started to become really overwhelming. So autism research that was not useful or relevant to our lives. Faulty research designs because the researchers didn't understand what it's like to be autistic. Research that stigmatized, stereotyped, or further marginalized autistic people. Research that we even felt might cause harm. And Christina was at the time doing community-based participatory research with the African American and Latina communities. And she realized that one could substitute African American for autistic in all of those conversations, and the issues in research would still be the same. So we decided to stop complaining and do something about it by forming a new autism research group using this community-based participatory um, framework to engage between researchers and the at almost the exact same time. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which is a autistic run community-based policy and many other things organization, got their start. And their first act was to lead the push to get New York University Child Study Center to remove this horribly stigmatizing ableist billboard campaign called Ransom Notes. I have an example pictured here. Uh, they were really terrible, and the disability community as a whole gave a pushback. And I include this in part as an example of an academic research institution and the community really being at odds, and it's a good illustration of those frictions. Um, the campaign was successful. The billboards were removed. ASAN became Aspire's first and earliest community-based partner. Throughout this time, there was a lot of fighting for inclusion and against stigmatizing media as autism awareness grew and it became increasingly intense. In 2007, the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee was reinstated to now include adult outcomes, although the focus remained and still today seems to be predominantly on children, and including one single autistic member. In 2009, Autism Speaks came out with a new stigmatizing media campaign. This going back to my story about the sleep researcher, and there were nationwide protests. So here's a fun fact. This photo is actually from the Portland protest, and I painted those signs, and they were really, really heavy. That was a bit of a mistake, but my lettering is nice. And Time Magazine ran a story about us and the protests, and it acknowledged that the autistic community's parodies of these media pieces were actually much more effective than the original. If you've ever heard the phrase, "I'm a person, not a puzzle," that throws back to these protests and the fraught relationship with that particular organization. This is another example of autistic culture and the importance of understanding that culture if you plan to engage with community. So if you put puzzle pieces on your flyers, you might be alienating anybody who identifies as being part of autistic culture. In the late 2000s, we also started seeing real movement on what we had been working toward. In 2009, Aspire got its first NIH-funded research grant to look at healthcare disparities, which Christina is going to talk more about in this series. And then in 2010, the autistic community was able to lobby for and get increased autistic representation on the IACC, which has continued to this day. 2008, Aspire gave the first presentation on CBPR with the autistic community at a scientific conference. And in 2011, we published our first paper. And over the years now, we have seen this glorious explosion of community academic partnerships internationally. This is a screenshot of a slide from a 2018 talk that Christina and I gave for the International Society for Autism Research for their Summer Institute, which shows some of these collaborations. There were more then, there are even more now. INSAR also just this year started an Autistic Researchers Committee, which I'm a founding member of. So it's been really thrilling to be a part of this history and see how, though it does take time, these massive systems can shift toward collaboration and inclusion. And things are very different now from where we started. Okay, so I'm all excited and proud now of my community and my colleagues, but to take a deep breath, if you want to create these collaborations, it's going to take some work. So I talked a lot about the autistic community's very tumultuous relationship with the research community. And because of that history and the long-term and also much more recent hurts and distrusts, those things are very real and they're a very fresh part of our experience, even within trusted collaborations like Aspire. So we just started a new R01 to look at outcomes, uh, uh, health outcomes for autistic adults. And we added a bunch of new autistic partners to our collaboration. And we spent a huge, huge portion of our first couple of team meetings just reassuring and demonstrating over and over again that yes, we did really, really, really want and respect their opinions, that yes, they truly are in control of the decisions that Aspire is making, that yes, they have power and the researchers weren't going to be mean and awful to them and trample all over them. And that yes, it's totally acceptable to stim in front of the camera and we're all going to be doing it. And yes, this is a safe place for autistic culture because it's not a given ever. This stuff is deep and it's fresh. So I wanted to just run through a couple of points for you to consider if you'd like to approach the community for collaboration, and I really hope you do. I've focused a little more high level here, but Christina in her webinar last week gave a whole lot of very practical ways that you can work on and build these collaborations. So these sort of fit together. And during the Q&A, if you want any practical advice or practical solutions, I encourage you to ask me questions about that. It's not going to be in these slides, but it can certainly help. So the first consideration is power. If you are not the autistic person, you have it, they don't. If you are a researcher, even if you are autistic, as I am, I have more power. I have educational power. This is, intersectionality 101 of shifting spaces of privilege and marginalization. Uh, if you have power, you're probably not thinking about it. The autistic community and the autistic population is a historically disempowered, stigmatized population, and we are a disempowered and stigmatized community. And this requires an active attention to power at all times. It means finding ways to ensure that others have power, but it also may mean giving up your power in order to equalize it. So when ASPIRE first started, we did all of our meetings through online text-based chat, which we as the autistic community we were, using that for years back to those original internet days. We were all very comfortable. We had, we knew how to do it. We had our own social patterns, and Christina was so out of her depth. She said that she didn't understand any of the social norms that were used in online text chat. Everything was going by too fast. She couldn't process, she couldn't get a word in, she couldn't type fast enough to keep up with the conversation. And we just sort of laughed and we were like, we love you, Christina, but now you know what it feels like to be us. Now you know what it feels like to have to be at have a communication disability, because now that the accessibility needs are flipped. But it did a lot for equalizing power, because for aggressive researchers who are used to going in and dominating a scene, that lack of ability to do that really changed the power dynamics. So there are structural things that you can do to equalize power. Power is a really big deal in community-based participatory research and in all participatory action research, emancipatory participatory research approaches and methods. So I want to also encourage anyone who wants to do this to look at the general CBPR community engaged practice literature, because there's a lot of work that's been done for a lot of years on power, and a lot of resources that can, the things that apply to other marginalized communities when you're engaging in research also applies to us. Some of the details might be different, but the ideas are very much the same. And CBPR, community engaged practice, has been around since the 1940s. And it's got a lot of rich resources. So that's another place that you can go to look for information on how to deal with power in these collaborations. The second consideration is trust, and you can't ever take it for granted. I hope that the little mini history lesson shows why why the community doesn't particularly trust researchers on a lot of different levels. The trust, like power balance, takes a tremendous and active effort to build and sustain. It's not something that you do once and it's all good. It's something that you are continuously engaging in. And it runs both ways, right? The community, you need to do things that will enable your community collaborators to feel like they can trust you. But you also need to be able to trust your community members. And we can be prickly, and we're people. It's a community full of people, and some of us are trustworthy and some of us are not. So that trust is a reciprocal thing. Again, CBPR, Community Engaged Practice Lit, has a lot of resources and a lot of discussion that's been had on the topic of trust. Again, it's an issue when you're talking about research with any marginalized community. The third consideration is authentic engagement. Like everything else takes real work. I again really encourage you to look at Christina's talk last week. Plus, Aspire has a lot of papers and resources that are about this. Um, there should be some links available. Uh, don't just throw autistic people into your mix and think that that's going to be a collaboration. In addition to considerations around power and trust, you're also probably going to be working with lay people. So these are people who are not, don't know the science jargon, might be intimidated by the science jargon, might have community hot buttons about it. I'm an intervention researcher, and the word intervention is like a horrible word to the community because intervention was used so much to describe things that would extinguish autistic characteristics or behaviors that we actually found really adaptive and caused a lot of trauma. So it's trying to reclaim that word of intervention and say, no, an intervention is just something that causes a change. And what we need to do is make sure that the changes that we're causing are ones that we want. I actually have an editorial I wrote on that. I didn't give the link, but you can look at Autism in Adulthood. There's an editorial on reclaiming science for the community that deals a bit with that. Um, so anyway, when you're thinking about authentic engagement and authentic inclusion, you have to think about like, how are we going to make it so that when people are given decision-making power, they have what they need to make those decisions. They know what the words mean, they know what the science is, they know what the decisions are. Um, they have things in accessible formats. The meetings are accessible. All of these things have to be there in order for people to be actually a part of the collaboration, and um, not just the autistic person who's sitting there so that you can say, oh, hey, look, I have an autistic person sitting here. Um, again, there are autism specific things. Christina talked a lot about them, but don't be afraid of drawing from other literatures or other, when you're thinking about how do I present scientific concepts to students who have never engaged with these concepts before, you can use some of those same techniques when you're dealing with collaboration. And also, it's okay to ask for help on engagement strategies from the community or from other research groups, because unlike back when Aspire first started and we were the only ones doing this kind of work, as you saw, there's now a lot of people who are doing this kind of work. So please ask for help, ask for resources. There are a lot of voices of experience on both the community and the academic side. And then the fourth consideration when building collaborations is one of consistent commitment, which when a community has been burnt, saying you're going to make amends or doing something the community wants a few times or sticking an autistic person on your board is absolutely not going to be enough for the community to trust you or to feel like that hurt has been relieved. You need to make good on those promises, and you need to do it every time for years, every single time. So I recently got into this with respect to Autism Speaks Again, and somebody asking me, well, what would it take for you to support that organization and take money from them? I mean, they added autistic people to their board and they fund some service studies now, and they're trying to make nice with the community. And I had to think for a really long time about my answer to that and why it's not enough, why what's been done is not enough. And it's not enough because it's not long enough and it's not consistent enough. It's not, they're not honoring our priorities all the way across the board. And there was also too much distrust to start. So this consistent commitment idea doesn't have to be an epic situation like that. With Aspire, it's part of what I really try to do. We make as researchers a promise to our community members that we are going to always listen and that we are always going to prioritize autistic voice and prioritize the autistic community. And that means that I have an obligation to do that every time. Every single time I have to do that. If people give me feedback on some materials, then I need to go and find a way to incorporate that feedback into the materials. I can't just write it off. Um, this doesn't mean compromising the science, right? So if the community says, "Oh well, we want this thing," and you're like, "Oh no, that's going to totally screw up the science," that's not what I'm talking about. Because as a scientist, I can explain the consequences if we do something that's going to be bad for the science to the community. We can have a discussion and we can work together with me or with other researchers to find something that both honors the autistic priorities and the autistic voice and doesn't compromise the science. These are discussions, they're collaborations. It's not a either or this or that. But it does mean having a conversation and having that consistent commitment every time. And again, there's a lot of hurt to overcome, and I hope that that was a little bit evident from my brief history. But also, honoring commitment is really good ethics. So there are many reasons to do it. Right. So the last thing I'm going to talk about before the Q&A is I'm going to talk a little bit about the autistic burnout study as an example of some benefits of these collaborations. I'm not going to talk about the actual study or the science because I'm going to do that in November. So for now, you'll just get a teaser, but if you're interested in the actual study, tune back in for a webinar in November. So I want to pull back to the very start of this talk and the original questions that I asked you to hold space for as the talk proceeded, which is engaging with the autistic community. Why does it matter? So autism research affects the quality of our lives. We affect the quality of autism research, and collaboration can lead to. So yes, I'm going to talk about the actual study, November 19th. But I think it's an example of the good things that can happen when the autistic community and the research community have a strong collaboration. So autistic burnout is a high community priority. It's an urgent, long-standing thing that has been discussed in these forums for years and years and years. Autistic people describe it as causing significant distress, loss of function, loss of independence, leading to suicidal behavior, something that really deeply affects our lives. However, until recently, there were 0 papers on it in the published lit, none. No research has been done, no researcher has looked into this. If you do a lit search, you find that the focus is all on caregiver burnout. So the burnout that occurs from the horror of having to deal with us, not the burnout that we might experience because of our relationship to the world. So you may have known this, I hope you did, but if you didn't, it's an example of a place where researchers might not know what people are prioritizing because they're not steep deep inside of that culture. Um, so Aspire decided to do a study on it because we know. So community trust and accessible materials. We collaboratively work together to put together these materials. The community knows us, they trust us. I filled my qualitative sample in about a week for no effort. If you've ever struggled with recruitment, I am always floored when this happens. Got really rich personal interviews. People trusted me as a person to talk to, trusted our team, our RAs, because they know us. I got multiple contacts from people asking how they could help on the study. We then did a survey. I got really good, clean data. People understood it, no missing data points, really great response rate. A lot of really grateful feedback. I'm so glad somebody is researching this. Finally, someone's doing this. And it was a strong membership check to our qualitative findings. This is, I think, an example of better research through collaboration. Things were easy, they were clean, we got great data. people were excited about it. Um, and then it's a little early to tell for sure, but there's been at least a short term, really high impact, both for the community and for researchers. So, for example, the paper, the first paper that we published on the Autistic Burnout Project ended up on Reddit Science and got over 46,000 upticks and almost 2,000 comments that were largely supportive, grateful, and excited. Um, we got over 150,000 downloads of the paper in June alone, which is like, whoa. And that's both the community, the autistic community and the research community enthusiastic and downloading. I've had a lot of people really grateful. The paper included some strategies that people have used to reduce burnout. Hopefully they're for real and can help people. The long-term impact again remains to be seen, but I think it's a good start. So that's a little bit of, positive things that I think would not have happened either as easily or as much if there hadn't been a deep long-term involvement between the autistic community and the researchers in Aspire. So summary to all of that, the takeaway, if nothing else, community priorities, community knowledge, trust, and authentic inclusion, plus sound research methods, power sharing, and scientific expertise equals science that can create a positive impact for everyone. So I want to say thank you to all of you who have listened to this kind of odd webinar, odd for me. I want to say thank you to the Aspire team, to all our research participants, and to the members of the autistic community who have shared their wisdom and experience with us, with me. Um, I have to give a plug, I'm the associate editor for Autism in Adulthood, an academic journal. We're multidisciplinary, we're interested in all sorts of stuff. Please consider submitting. And I have some contact information up here if you want to contact me after the talk. And my website is there, and I have a newsletter if you want to sign up for that. That's monthly. I think I'm now done and can go to questions.
I'm going to come back, Dora. Will you just stop sharing your screen and then start my video?
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Um, um, one thing you said that really stood out to me, I loved everything, but um, the the way that you said that research is done on you or about you, but not with you. And it's just like the nothing about us without us that the disability community, um, has as your, what would you refer to that as? It's not a slogan really, but kind of like your,
Motto, maybe?
yeah, yeah. uh,
A call to action?
yes, exactly. Because this really is about human rights and, you know, making sure that autistic people are um, viewed as fully human, wonderful people with a lot to contribute. And I just, I think being able to hear it in those little snippets will help people keep in mind the importance of everything that researchers do that then has trickle effects down, throughout the community. Um, okay, we do have one question so far, and I have a few as well. I'll go to the question first. So it says, "Thank you so much for this talk. Very engaging and illuminating. It all makes such good sense. Please talk to us about ABA as an intervention from the viewpoint of the autistic community."
Okay, so my big disclaimer, I don't do that type of research. So it's outside of my expertise. I don't know the nuances.
Right.
Um, the community has some pretty strong ideas around normalization, and there are studies that are coming in. There are studies that are coming in around the idea of masking or camouflaging, and that by trying to hide your autisticness, which is what ABA in a lot of ways teaches people to do might have very detrimental effects, which is something that the community has been talking about for a long, long. This research isn't necessarily directed at ABA, but it is sort of the point. Um, I there's a long when I talk about like interventions that may cause harm, ABA is probably at the top of my head. There's a really wonderful post by a ABA therapist, and I'll send you the link, Jen, after this talk that you can stick up on the YouTube, where she talks about her journey in understanding the community's viewpoint on ABA, and I think she's going to answer that question better and more fully than I will. Um, I'm pragmatic, and I think that self-directed treatment, when somebody actually wants it and they agree to it and it's been ethically set up, is, I'm not going to go stomp on that because it's a person's choice. But as a whole, the autistic community has been fairly opposed to things that try to us of I mean, if you think about it, imagine that something about who you are is being consistently told it's bad and you have to not do it. Think about the kind of impact on your psyche, if nothing else, and then the extra effort to hold that in and maintain it. And I think that you can also look to I love analogies, and I think you can also look to some other communities like the queer community and suppressing homosexual feelings. And I think there's a lot to trouble in there, and I'm not saying to completely throw out a therapy, because there are non-autistic people who benefit from it, and there are ways that you can do self-directed treatment where you want to do something like that. But always thinking about, like, what are we actually trying to accomplish here, and is it going to be helpful?
Right.
I'll
I
put that link in. I'm sorry, it's a little bit.
That's totally fine. We can and we'll add anything else that you think of that
And I
will.
think I think that will do I think that will do a much better justice to answering that question, a very full and well.
Okay. Um, that it's sort of related to one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, which is about the word recovery or cure, which in 2020 still kind of gets thrown around. A lot of like organizations and researchers and therapies do still kind of target recovery. Some even claim that autistic people can behaviorally recover with intense therapy. So what is your take on the word recovery? And it's perhaps similar to what you just said. But what are the implications when, you know, researchers or clinicians have that sort of mindset versus, more of like an empowering view of, how do we support this person and how does that sort of perception influence community?
I think this is you're seeing that conflicting paradigm. I mean, that's a medical model, pathological model paradigm
Yeah.
of autism. It's not a social model of disability. And so that's a lens right there. Again, I think that my hope is that in another 10, 15 years, it's going to be kind of like having these conversations about homosexuality. Like,
Right.
yes, there are still people who want to cure homosexuality, but by and large, our society doesn't hold that viewpoint anymore. Um, I so a couple of things. Try to I don't know how always careful, like how political should I be? But but just speaking from a community perspective, and as a researcher, one, there is a lot of research that is coming out about harms related to people because of that mindset. Um, and I think that we need to take them seriously because a lot of them culminate in suicide. And we do know that there was a paper that came out that showed that the highest reason for mortality among autistic adults who do not have intellectual disability is suicide. So
Uh,
these are serious problems, and I don't think we can afford to just brush that off as some radical community viewpoint. I think that there's real research that's starting to be behind this stuff. I also think that yeah, so that I did want to temper that on the other side, though, not about recovery, because like, why would you want to recover from being who you are? Really. Um, but uh, I think sometimes there's a false idea that the community doesn't want treatment for anything. Um, but there are a lot of people who are in a lot of distress because of things like, anxiety or depression, or the impacts of discrimination, internalized stigma. I mean, these are real problems. So from a community standpoint, it's not like we're opposed to the idea of therapy. We're opposed to the idea of treating autism because it's a part of who we are and it's not bad and it doesn't need to be treated.
right,
But we're not opposed to the idea of like getting therapy for depression or anxiety.
right,
I want to be clear on you. Um, I do, and I can't, it's very difficult for me to see another perspective. The evidence, and if you look at there's a treating of the autistic population like it's this special thing over here that like ordinary people doesn't, very different from ordinary people, but like, there's a big literature around suicide in healthcare providers.
mhm,
And there's been a big link between masking and camouflaging in health services and suicide. So, when you're a health service provider and you're constantly having to hide how deeply you feel about patient death and these
yeah,
horrific things that you're exposed to, and go talk to a family with a smile and compassion, that all of that emotional masking takes a huge toll, and it's a mediator in the high rates of mortality. And like, well, if autistic people are being forced to do that, like, why is that different?
right,
Why, just because you have this diagnosis, would you not have the same thing as people who don't?
right,
So I think there's a lot of richness behind these things, and it's another good reason to listen to the community, because the community is going to trouble the mainstream discourse and say, okay, hey, look, you know, researchers and y'all have decided that this is a good thing, but you can't just stop there. Science isn't like you just have one fact and it's done.
right,
Science is ever evolving. And I hope that some of this community infusion into science also going to help push it toward evolving and rethinking like the very basic research questions like, is eye contact a good thing or not?
right, yeah.
Sorry, that was a little disorganized and ranty of a
No, no, it's all great because, not everyone gets these opportunities to really ask and dig deep into these questions, and they're really important. And, that's why I wanted to have you here today, because we need more of these conversations to happen. So I'm really glad that you're delving into these things. Um, we have so the same person asked then, so how do we encourage self-directed treatment when harmful interventions are being done to young children?
um, so shared decision making stuff. I Okay, again, I'm not a clinician. Some of these questions might be better directed toward Christina, who is a clinician. But there's, I mean, if you're going to ask the same question about children who are getting cancer treatments or children who are, I mean, not that I want to equate those things, but I'm pretty sure there's a good literature at the moment and some good strategies for shared decision making with children who aren't autistic,
Right.
um, that maybe can be looked into. Again, I kind of encourage people to rethink. their conceptualization of what people are capable of. Um, I've done a lot of talking with other researchers about including people with intellectual disability in research, and they're like, oh, well, if they can't read, how could you possibly do this? And I'm like, it's an accessibility thing. Like, you just need to find a way to communicate. And maybe that means you use a lot of pictures. Maybe it means that you're doing one-on-one conversations before a meeting. And I think that those things also apply to children. I don't do research with children, but I have done some research with young adults, and that they're capable of quite a lot if you make things accessible to their developmental level. And
Mm.
it's going to take work and be hard, but that's not an excuse. I've heard excuses. Why is your study only open to people who are 18 and over? Oh, well, because it's too hard to get the informed consent. No. Yes, the informed consent is going to have to look different. And yes, you're going to have to put in work. But if your study is one that is appropriate to including people who are from a broader age range, just do it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's what I would say is don't just throw up your hands and give up. Look at what are other people doing. I think autism still, and this goes back to that thing I was talking about with, for some reason, as the disability rights movement
Mhm.
traveled along, autism stayed in this little medical bubble, as opposed to
Yeah.
traveling along with it, with along with Down syndrome and all of these other things that are much more um, advocate related at this point, self advocate related. And um, yeah, so that I think shared decision making is something that can always.
Yeah. Yeah. And really, it goes into the concept of autonomy and, um, centering the the autonomy of the child long term, because they deserve to have some say in what happens to them, even as children. And then, you know, um, in rethinking what isn't versus what is, I think is an important shift. So, just as you were saying with the social model of disability, if someone can't talk, you know, yes, research that would be looking into, um, how language works in the brain and what sorts of mechanisms or differences there might be, so that we could better understand and perhaps see if there's technologies that would help someone, to be able to communicate more easily. But in the meantime, from a social perspective, it's, well, what can we do to help that person communicate in a way that they're able? And so it's not just focusing on the person can't do this. It's, well, what can they do and how can we help them
I
do it?
would I would go even one step deeper and say, who says that speech is a privileged form of communication?
Right. Right.
you know, why not put all communications on an equal level
Right.
and allow people to communicate in the way that's going to work best for them?
Yeah. Without any, my daughter is an AAC user. And, one of the biggest barriers for her has been attitudinal barriers. And so it's not the disability of not being able to speak, it's actually the perceptions of the adults in her life who, she has to then like prove herself enough. And, so it's really, it's a lot of what happens is very much influenced by perception, which is very much influenced by language and what research says and how it says it.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's how you frame those questions. Is the question, how do we get children talking? Or
right,
is the question, how do we match people with communications?
right.
Uh,
So
or
it's
is the question, how do we get society to accept a broader range of communication modalities?
right,
Like, those are three very different questions that all are trying to get at the same outcome of effective communication. But how those questions are asked, what those questions are, what it's going very different. And I think that the community might be talking about more how do we get society to be more accepting of multimodal
Yeah.
rather than how do we get someone.
Yeah. Um, so in thinking about the community and the nothing about us without us, Dr. Nicolaitis had brought up a great point last week as well about how obviously autistic people should have a say in the types of projects that get funded as well. Um, so and you mentioned earlier that autism research affects the quality of your lives. um,
Very much, yeah.
and clearly I see that as a parent of an autistic person as well, and I really hope that more research will be geared toward you know things that are important to the community and things that will help all of you to you know remove barriers basically. But so what are some of the biggest gaps that you see in the types of research being done versus what the community needs?
So I mean, I'm a social services researcher, and that's kind of where I go. Social services research is something that is really is pretty heavily backed by the community, and it still comprises just the tiny. Specifically, social services research for adults is like the tiniest sliver of funding there is, but it's also probably one of the more important for the community. And I mean that includes better delivery of services. It includes more inclusive services, services that take intersectionality into it now. Like, yes, you might be an autistic job seeker, but you might also be an African American autistic job seeker. That multiple marginalization mean for employment and discrimination? I think there are a lot of questions that fall into that the work social services type bucket that are actually the community. That's where I go. I think that also research that looks at ways to take the burden off of us. So, there's a lot of research into like how do we teach autistic people how to go do job interviews. Yeah, and that puts like a lot of burden on the people who are already bearing a huge burden and being discriminated against in the workplace and all of this stuff. So how about instead doing research on how to support supervisors to like better adapt to an autistic person in an interview? I've been looking a little bit at employment interviews for veterans, and there's a lot more literature and research around that focuses on the employers and the supervisors as opposed to on the veterans. And so like I think those are some really great areas for research, autism research to go in, is how can we support people in the environment around the autistic person and move some of the burden onto somebody who can better bear it,
Yeah.
and maybe who should more bear it. And I think that also, I mean, I'm a system scientist, so I'm always thinking to how does this long term shift systems. And I think that the more of that gets done, the more chance it has to dissipate out into the larger community. It's, like visibility. The more disabled people there are out in the community, the more acceptable it becomes. It's a lot less weird to see somebody in a wheelchair now than it was in 1950,
Right.
right? And so I think that there's over time there can be ripple effects that are really positive to changing social structure. I'll say got a little bit nonlinear off topic, but yeah, I think that social services focused research and multidisciplinary research that might target things outside of the like remediate an autistic behavior box
Right.
are probably more appealing to the community
Yeah.
and potentially will have a bigger impact.
Yeah. And honestly, even research on it on the adult age group, I guess. I mean, it's a long period of time was the point I'm getting to, is people spend much more time as adults generally than they do as children. But most of the funding tends to go to autistic children. Um, So, I'm pulling this stat out, and I can't think of the exact numbers, but I believe that the general life expectancy of autistic people is much lower than neurotypical people. So that seems to be an important area to
Mhm.
further explore as well. I'm sure there's an array of reasons for that, including the suicide and, you know, um, different issues that may come up, which many could probably be preventable if more research was, done to really ascertain like reasons behind that. Um,
I think there's also social determinants of health at
yeah,
play. People think about disability as a bad outcome,
yeah,
um, but disability is also a social determinant of health.
right,
Uh, I
right.
Yeah, so
And
that's
and it's a natural part of humanity, you
yeah.
know. So
Most people will experience it.
yes, yes. Um, okay.
We're all sort of experiencing it right now, right?
We are. Um, we only had one other comment, which was in relation to the communication, which said, "Isn't the core of neurodiversity accepting any matter of communication?"
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a value in all of it. And who is to say that, the way of thinking that works better with a specific modality isn't like super important.
yes,
And
exactly.
and even if it's not important, that's a human being. They should be valued
Right,
for
right.
being alive, for being there, for being cool.
Yes, and honestly, what amazing adaptive skills, people have to communicate in such an array of ways, and actually, you know, communicating with people who, like, my daughter doesn't speak, but she communicates so much and so beautifully, and, I, like, take joy in seeing the way that she experiences the world, and I personally delight in, just seeing the way that she experienced it. It's different from my experience, but it's awesome. So, and I know that was very sappy, and I apologize, but
Okay. Makes me happy. I'm glad for you, but I'm also very glad for her to have you as so
oh,
there I can be snappy back.
that's so nice. Thank you so much. Um, okay, so I'm gonna say the dates of when we're going to meet next, and I want to end with a paragraph from Jim Sinclair's "Don't Mourn for Us." But before I do that, Dr. Raymaker is going to be back with us to present on autistic burnout, which will be Thursday, November 19th at 3 p.m. And Dr. Nicolaitis will be back on Thursday, November 12th, and she'll be presenting on healthcare for autistic adults. Um, Dr. Raymaker shared a number of really great links with us. I encourage everyone to look them over. I wasn't even familiar with all of them, and I have quite a collection, so I can't wait to read them myself. Um, but I would
More
like,
hot off the press.
yes, I would like to leave with a paragraph from Jim's "Don't Mourn for Us," if I could. Um, so it says, "This is what I think Autism Society should be about. Not mourning for what never was, but exploration of what is. We need you. We need your help and your understanding. Your world is not very open to us, and we won't make it without your strong support. Yes, there is tragedy that comes with autism, not because of what we are, but because of the things that happen to us. Be sad about that if you want to be sad about something. Better than being sad about it, though, get mad about it and then do something about it. The tragedy is not that we're here, but that your world has no place for us to be. How can it be otherwise as long as our own parents are still grieving over having us brought into the world?" And this whole essay is just so powerful. And, you know, I can't say enough about how important it is for any parent, researcher, clinician, teacher, anyone autistic people, I'm sure most of you know about this, but so I don't need to tell you about it, but um, I just think it's such an important shift that we all really need to embrace. And I am so grateful to you, Dr. Raymaker, for your work. And this this information is so transformative in making sure that we can continue on this forward path for all autistic people. So thank you so much. So we will be back actually next Thursday, the 22nd. We'll be back with Dr. Mona Delahook. So we will look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you so much for joining us today.